This classic and iconic film was released in 1942 and is set in Casablanca, which was at that time a French unoccupied territory in Morocco. It's about a reluctant hero living in a town that is straddling the line between good and evil. This hero has to come to terms with the fact that life is unfair, yet despite this, he still finds meaning. I'll give a brief synopsis before I delve into the significance of the main character Rick and Casablanca. Rick is a charismatic bar owner in Casablanca in the middle of World War II. The Germans have not taken over that area yet, but are working their way towards it. He comes into possession of some very valuable travel documents that he promptly tucks away for safekeeping and tells no one about. On that same day, an important war hero, Victor, comes into town, and we soon learn that Victor will need those papers to continue his noble work. The catch is that Victor happens to be married to the woman Rick loves, Ilsa. Rick is bitter about Ilsa because she left him abruptly without reason, just as they were about to escape the war together and potentially live happily ever after. Ilsa tries to explain why she left him, but Rick won't listen at first, and then when the next day he thinks better of it and decides to hear her out, it's too late. She won't explain. Everything comes to a head when Ilsa discovers that Rick has the travel papers. She goes to him and begs him for them. He refuses and won't hear her out, so she pulls a gun on him. He doesn't flinch and tells her to go ahead and shoot him, but she can't do it. They end up embracing, and then the truth comes out. Ilsa reveals that on the day she left Rick, she had discovered that Victor, the husband she thought had died trying to escape a concentration camp, was actually alive and needed her. She hadn't told Rick because she knew he'd stay and then be imprisoned by the Germans. She throws herself at his mercy and declares that she loves him and can't leave him again. The movie concludes with Rick setting everything up so that it looks like he's going to not only get the girl, but betray Victor, by making it so the bad guys can put him back in a concentration camp. But it's all a ruse, so that he can actually get Victor on the plane with Ilsa. Ilsa doesn't want to go, but Rick convinces her that she won't be able to live with herself if she doesn't. While this is a romantic drama, it has the basic structure of a comedy. Keep in mind that a comedy isn't always meant to be for laughs, although there are some great comedic moments in this film. The comedy format sets us up with an expectation that after the misunderstanding between the lovers is cleared up, that they will finally end up together. And I have to admit that when I saw this film for the first time as a young adult, I remember being disappointed that they don't. I now see that I missed the point. At that time, even in the US, where we have a history of pride and rugged individualism, people put their personal needs on hold for the cause. Sacrifice for the greater good was culturally reinforced and generally expected. Just a couple months before the release of Casablanca, my own grandfather left to join the army when my mother was just a month old and was overseas for 3 years before he got to see her again. Due to his age, he hadn't been required to enlist, but he'd enlisted out of a sense of duty. His sacrifice was not uncommon. In another time, the story would have more likely followed a traditional comedy format, where a misunderstanding leads to the lovers' divide, and then, of course, they keep missing opportunities to reconcile, until some ultimate revelation uncovers the truth so that they can finally reunite and fly off into the sunset together to live happily ever after. But this story is clever and poignant for not gratifying this implied expectation. This is because it was a time when you didn't get to have what you wanted. There were bigger concerns than fairy tale endings. You either joined the fight, which was not a great option, or stayed out, another bad option. Those who joined risked their lives, and those who stayed out not only risked the future of the world, but their own conscience. Humphrey Bogart's Rick is one of my favorite types of heroes. He is a compelling and self-reliant yet reluctant hero. He is convinced that he can go his own way and ignore the needs of others and the greater good, but ultimately he does the right thing when he discovers deep down that that is what he really wants, not least of all because the right thing turns out to be actually in his best interest. Rick declares early on, "I stick my neck out for nobody." He has a Han Solo kind of appeal. a well-crafted social facade or persona where he presents himself as self-sufficient, a loner just looking to take his share of the loot, who'd rather be on his own, free to make up his morality as he goes. It's just business. It's as if he's trying to convince himself as much as everyone else that his persona is his true self. We get a clue to his inner struggle when we first see him. He's playing chess alone against himself in the bar. We get more clues about Rick from his unsavory cohorts. Somehow, even though he knows Rick doesn't like him, the murderer-thief Ugarte only trusts Rick to look after his stolen papers. And Louis, the corrupt officer, observes of Rick, "I suspect that under that cynical shell you are at heart a sentimentalist." The corrupt actors of Casablanca can recognize a phony. Deep down, Rick craves meaning and connection. This is evidenced by his relationship with Sam, the piano man, his faithful companion who goes wherever Rick goes. Sam won't leave him, even when offered double to play at a rival nightclub. Sam is not only likable, but faithful and caring, and represents Rick's hidden virtue. It's the same idea as Han Solo and his trusty sidekick, Chewbacca. Rick's problem is that he got abandoned by the woman he loved. He let himself be vulnerable, and he has the attitude of one who's never going to let that happen again. We see this when he casually casts aside a woman who's in love with him at the opening of the film. She wants to see him later that night, but he just coldly replies, "I never make plans that far ahead." This echoes what Ilsa had said to him in the flashback when he'd suggested they get married when they got to Marseille. That's too far ahead to plan. Casablanca represents the border between good and evil. It is literally neutral territory and a plane ride away from either salvation or tyranny. It is full of thieves, cutthroats, and murderers, as well as good souls trying to flee the horrors of war. Rick is there because he can't go back to his home in America, which in this film represents freedom and salvation, due to something nefarious he did in his past. And he can't go to occupied Europe or he will be arrested for other crimes. Casablanca mirrors Rick's psyche. He's stuck in purgatory. The question is, can he stay there on the border of good and evil, or will he choose a side? He's trying to coast his way through life without addressing this question, but as life, or good script writing, is apt to do, he is being forced to address it. Victor Laszlo, on the other hand, is stuck in Casablanca but shouldn't be there. When Louis asks him if he slept well, he responds, "I slept very well," to which Louis replies, "That's strange. No one is supposed to sleep well in Casablanca." And the point here is that a person with a clear conscience can sleep there no problem. Even though the film is essentially about Rick, Victor Laszlo is the noble and virtuous hero of the story. He embodies the cause. He stands for what needs to be done. He also stands for what Rick wants to reject. At one point, Rick asks Victor, "Don't you sometimes wonder if it's worth all this? I mean, what you're fighting for?" Victor replies, "You might as well question why we breathe. If you stop breathing, you'll die. If we stop fighting our enemies, the world will die." Rick knows this deep down, he just doesn't want to believe it. After Rick says, "Well, what of it?" Victor calls him out on it. "You sound like someone who's trying to convince himself of something he doesn't believe in his heart." Rick's persona is more in line with Louis, careless of other people and willing to take advantage. But Rick can see Louis for what he is, and it conflicts with his true moral compass. In this way, Louis represents Rick's shadow. We get to see the compassionate side of Rick, who is repulsed by this shadow when the young bride comes to him begging for help. Rick is moved to help her avoid the degradation of having to submit to Louis in order to get the travel papers. Rick quietly makes it so that her young groom, who is losing at the roulette table, wins big. Even though Rick is bitter that he didn't get to have his own bride, he is willing to help the young couple. There is something very touching in how he preserves her virtue not only for her, but for the groom, someone who represents who Rick wants to be but can't. If he was a truly bitter and cynical man, he could have let things play out as they were going to, and maybe even enjoy seeing another man suffer and love. As we know, misery loves company. Even though Rick doesn't get to have his perfect happy ending, he gives this couple the chance to have it. In a time where everyone had to sacrifice, the young couple represents hope for the future. The reason I emphasize that this is a comedy is because it follows the pattern very closely. The lovers are kept apart and in a state of discord due to a misunderstanding. The real reason that Ilsa didn't join Rick on the train in Paris isn't revealed until near the end. When all is revealed, Ilsa gives over all decision-making to Rick. Now at this stage of the story, we expect the happy ending. But there's this nagging little thing still out there, Victor, who represents the cause. So this leaves Rick with having to make a decision. Who will he be? Will he become his persona, who will get to have the girl but without meaning as it will undermine Victor and the cause? Or the inner Rick, who knows that he can't really have the girl without meaning? They dangle persona Rick, who gets to have the sunset fantasy in front of us. But then at the last second, the true Rick comes through and saves the day. He gives up the girl. And he doesn't just give up the girl, he bolsters her fidelity in Victor's eyes. He gives Victor the same thing he gives to the bridegroom, a devoted partner unsullied by the nasty nature of war. Victor can see the full extent of Rick's sacrifice, and this gives Victor hope, something he will need at the front line of the cause. Victor says to Rick, "Welcome back to the fight. This time I know our side will win." Of course, we yearn for the happy ending where Rick and Ilsa fly off together, but at what cost? Are we, the audience, willing to see Victor, the cause, sacrifice for something that can't possibly have meaning when one considers the cost? Also, it's important that Rick make the decision on his own in the end, because in such times, everyone is needed to help the cause, and each person needs to dig deep into themselves and wrestle those demons that try to convince us we should just look the other way. Unless you are like Victor, where your morality and motivation is clear, you are likely to come across a time in your life where you have to choose between getting the metaphorical girl or supporting the greater good. This story shows us that even when life's not fair, you can still choose the way that will have meaning. It's a beautiful compromise they give us when Rick walks away into the fog with Louis, uttering the iconic line, "Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship." Here we see that Rick has made friends with his shadow, and will use this union to help the cause. We know that the big war still looms large out there, all around him, and it will require some of the gifts of the shadow, such as cunning and deception, to conquer the tyrannical force that threatens to destroy the world. The implication is that Rick and Louis will work together on the side of good now, and it leaves us with hope.